Entonces me da mucho gusto invitar, ¿no? Dar la bienvenida a John Sellars a esta sesión del SIFAR. John es de Royal Holloway en la Universidad de Londres. Ahí es profesor desde hace muchos años y tiene una obra pues muy importante sobre el estoicismo, sobre la filosofía antigua en general, pero en particular sobre el estoicismo, o al menos es la parte de su obra que yo conozco mejor. Y bueno, y es un autor, John, que ha tenido una enorme influencia, incluido en el mundo de habla hispana. Recientemente acaban de salir en Taurus 2 libros de John Sellars. Uno se llama Lecciones de Estoicismo y otro libro distinto, también en Taurus, Lecciones de Epicureísmo. Entonces son libros de gran circulación, pero John también es un erudito, ¿no? Y su obra no se limita a libros de divulgación, es un investigador de primera línea. Y entonces le doy la bienvenida a John, quien nos va a hablar hoy sobre A Newly Recovered Stoic Account of the Emotions. John, thanks a lot for accepting to participate in this session of the SIFAR. We're very grateful.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be talking to you. Apologies for speaking to you in English. I wish I was able to speak to you in Spanish, but I'm afraid that's beyond my abilities. I'm going to share my screen now.
Yes, go ahead.
So I hope you can all see this. And so as you can see, my title is A Newly Recovered Stoic Account of the Emotions. And the question mark at the end of the title is very deliberate. What I want to do in this talk is outline an account of the Stoic theory of emotions that's quite different from the one that that I'll call the standard account. And this new account can be found in a 14th century Byzantine text, or maybe it's an Italian text. We can come back to that later on. And it might reflect evidence from sources that have since been lost. And so it might be telling us something new about the Stoic view. Alternatively, it might be some horribly garbled confusion of some quite different view. Or it could be a complete fabrication. It's not clear. But whichever it is, I think it counts as an interesting and neglected moment in the history of the reception of Stoic philosophy. Now, in a moment, I'll introduce the text that records this new account and its author. But first, let me say a little bit about what I'm going to call the standard Stoic account of emotions. And this derives from 3 main sources: Cicero, Diogenes Laertius, and the epitome of Stoic ethics by Arius Didymus that we find in Stobaeus. And the account that they report is usually thought to go back to Chrysippus. And according to these sources, the Stoics held that emotions are the product of judgments that we make, and in particular, the product of value judgments. In Cicero's version, reported in the Tusculan Disputations, there are 4 primary types of emotional disturbance, each caused by the idea of there being something good or bad, either present or anticipated in the future. On this account, the idea that something good is present generates pleasure, and something good expected in the future generates desire. The idea that something bad is present generates distress, while the thought of something bad in the future generates fear. And the parallel accounts in Diogenes Laertius and Arius Didymus provide the Greek terms that Cicero renders into Latin, sometimes with more than one Latin term. And it might be useful at the outset to set out in full the terms that these different sources report for us. Okay, so the Stoics are, of course, famous for suggesting that we ought to avoid emotions, and in particular, the four types that I've just mentioned. The reason why is because the value judgments that they are based on are mistaken, they claim. They involve value judgments about external objects or states of affairs. And the Stoics held that none of these external things are inherently good or bad, only ever preferred or dispreferred. There's nothing inherently bad in the external world that could come along to justify experiencing fear, they argued. So these emotions ought to be avoided, not merely because they can be psychologically disruptive, but also, and perhaps more importantly, because they're the product of errors on our part. Now, alongside those four types of negative emotion, or let's call them disturbances, the Stoics also mention a number of corresponding good emotions. They identify three good emotions corresponding to three of the four types of disturbance, and one source describes them as their rational counterparts. So, for instance, the rational counterpart of fear is caution, the rational counterpart to pleasure is joy. And for these good emotions not to be based on error, it's sometimes been argued that their value judgments must relate to things that are genuinely good or bad. And for the Stoic, the only genuinely good thing is virtue, the only genuinely bad thing is its opposite, vice. So the Stoic sage, who is virtuous, will experience the emotion of joy in his own virtue, while also experiencing caution when faced with situations that might potentially put his or her virtue under threat. And the reason why there is no fourth good emotion corresponding to distress is that for a virtuous Stoic sage, free from vice, there is nothing genuinely bad present that could warrant a judgment that something bad is present right now. Okay, so there are lots of loose ends hanging off what I've just said, and we could spend all of our time just trying to tie those up, but that's not my main concern today. The important point is that all three of our different sources agree that this is more or less the Stoic view. Four main categories of emotional disturbance based on value judgments with three corresponding good emotions. And one of our three sources is Cicero, who we know had access to pretty much all of the early Stoic texts that were there, including pretty much all the works of Chrysippus, whose theory this probably was. Okay, so that just by way of background to set things up. Now let's turn to the text that I want to discuss along with its author. The text is called Ethica Secundum Stoicos, Ethics According to the Stoics. And its author is a man called Barlaam of Seminara. And because I think it'll be relevant to our discussion later on, I want just to say a little bit about who this person was and his biography. So he's born in Seminara, a town in Calabria in southern Italy, sometime around 1290. The southern part of Italy had long been Greek speaking, of course, and it was part of the Byzantine Empire for many centuries. Around the time that Barlaam was born, there were numerous Greek bishops in the region and around 25 Greek monasteries. So it's likely then that Barlaam was a native Greek speaker from southern Italy and brought up within the Byzantine Orthodox Church. We don't have much information about his early life, except that as a young man, he became a monk. And given that he had very wide intellectual interests spanning theology, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, it's been suggested he may have spent some time in some other schools in Italy. But the truth is, we really don't know that much about the early part of his life. What we do know is that around 1325, he headed east, traveling through Greece and finally arriving in Constantinople around 1330. Just a couple of years after that, a pair of Dominican bishops from Italy also arrived in Constantinople with a view to engage in discussions about the potential union of the Catholic and the Orthodox churches. And the Byzantine emperor asked Barlaam to speak on behalf of the Orthodox Church. So although he'd only just arrived, he was clearly already someone of some stature. And then the ongoing debates about the schism between the Eastern and the Western churches, central was the controversy over the use of the word filioque and the Son in the Creed. The Creed had stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, and a number of early Latin councils added the word filioque, in effect claiming that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. And as far as the Orthodox Church was concerned, this was an unwarranted and heterodox addition. Now, during the discussions, the Dominicans appear to have put forward a number of arguments drawn from their fellow Dominican Thomas Aquinas. And in response to this, Barlaam argued it's not possible to gain knowledge of God by the use of human reasoning. In particular, he wanted to challenge the Dominicans' use of syllogistic arguments in theological discussions. His argument was that the use of Aristotelian syllogistic arguments was inappropriate in theological debates because they would be unable in that context to meet the requirements set down by Aristotle in the Posterior Analytics. However, despite that, Barlaam was no anti-Aristotelian. In other works, he defends Aristotle from charges of inconsistency, and he was also keen to show that Aristotle and Plato ultimately agreed with one another, as one would expect in the Neoplatonic tradition. It's been suggested that his knowledge of Aristotle was perhaps limited to the physics, and this may have reflected that broader and not uncommon view that Aristotle's philosophy was primarily applicable to the natural world, while it was Plato's that was addressed to the immaterial world studied by metaphysics. So very much within the spirit of the wider Neoplatonic tradition. That's where we might locate Barlaam. In the midst of all of this, the Byzantine emperor sends Barlaam on a diplomatic mission to the west. He's likely to have visited Naples, and we'll come back to that later, and then heads on to Avignon, which was the seat of the papacy at the time. And at Avignon, he is said to have met Petrarch. The trip didn't last long. Barlaam soon goes back to Constantinople. His dispute with various other figures in the Byzantine church, in particular, a group of mystics based at Mount Athos, ultimately lead to Barlaam being excommunicated and his theological works being destroyed. So he heads back west, probably to Avignon, comes into contact with Petrarch again, and as every standard history of classical scholarship notes, he became Petrarch's Greek teacher. It's been suggested that Barlaam was teaching Greek in the papal curia. Now, Petrarch mentions Barlaam a number of times, mainly in his letters, and also mentions him briefly in a couple of his works. In particular, he says this, what small part of Plato's works do I have? With my own eyes, I have seen a great number of them, especially in the collection of Barlaam, the Calabrian, that modern paragon of Greek wisdom. He once began to teach me Greek, despite my ignorance of Latin letters, and perhaps he might have succeeded if death had not spitefully taken him from me and cut short this noble undertaking, as often it does. In due course, Barlaam converts to Catholicism after his excommunication from the Orthodox Church, and he becomes a bishop back in his home region of Calabria, and he journeys full circle. At some point in all of this, he also gets the chance to meet Boccaccio. Boccaccio was based in Naples and was in close contact with a man called Paolo of Perugia, who was librarian to the king in Naples. And again, we'll come back to this right at the end because it'll be relevant. Boccaccio comments in his works that he possessed materials scholarly materials that ultimately came from Barlaam, notes on pagan mythology. And these would prove especially useful for Boccaccio when he writes his genealogy of the pagan gods, in which he cites Barlaam as a source of information. As I say, we'll come back to that a bit later. Okay, so that, by way of background, gives us a sense of the time and context in which our text was written. So, ethics according to the Stoics. This text survives in one manuscript, which is now in Munich. It's been printed a couple of times, including in Ming's Patrologia Graeca, the last time it was printed. It's divided into two books. The first book discusses the nature of the good and is a defense of the Stoic view that virtue is the only good, against the Aristotelian view that a good life requires not only virtue, but also some other external goods. The second book discusses emotions. And there's a parallel with the first book here too, in that Barlaam wants to distance the Stoics from a broadly Aristotelian account of the emotions and argues against Theophrastus. So in both books, Barlaam is keen to stress the philosophical distance between the Stoics and the Aristotelians. It's perhaps also worth noting that he explicitly comments in the title of his work that it's been compiled from the books of the Stoics themselves. Okay, so what is Barlaam's distinctive account? It's, as I've said, in book 2 that he outlines his account of the emotions for the Stoics. And he starts off by drawing 3 distinctions that lay the foundations for his account. Right? So the first distinction is between what he calls true and false opinion. In particular, he has in mind opinions regarding what is good or bad, which are, of course, based on value judgments. When someone makes a correct value judgment, considering something good to be good, for instance, they'll hold a true opinion. And this is in line with standard Stoic thinking. The second distinction that he draws is between what he calls darkness of mind and evenness. And drawing an analogy with sight, Barlaam suggests that just as our vision is sometimes dull or foggy, so too sometimes a similar thing can happen with the mind. Now, when this happens with vision, it's unambiguously a bad thing. It's always better for our sight to be clear and sharp. And the same applies with the mind, Barlaam argues. When the mind is in a state of darkness, it's less able to follow reason and more likely to make errors. So this is obviously a state of mind that ought to be avoided. A little later on in his text, he'll identify such darkness of mind with emotional disturbances. And this clearly parallels familiar Stoic arguments about the dangers of emotional disturbances that can cloud the mind and inhibit our ability to reason clearly. The third distinction that he wants to draw is between a harmful will and a favorable will. He tells us that these labels simply refer to different types of appetite, which ought to be understood as impulse, horme. Once again, Barlaam takes it as straightforwardly obvious that a harmful will is something bad and to be avoided, while a favorable one is unconditionally good.
Okay.
And so he presents us with 3 divisions between our binary opposites, one good, the other bad, as you can see. Now, it's possible for the mind to have these 3 traits in a variety of different combinations. of the three negative traits, Barlaam points to a harmful will as the worst of the three to possess. He justifies this by saying that it is the most damaging because it inheres in the soul even without sudden or confused mental activity or false opinion. And what he seems to be referring to here is an ingrained habit of behavior. And given that he defines a harmful will as an appetite to act badly, and given that by appetite here we might understand impulse, horme, following Cicero, then what he seems to be referring to here is an ingrained habitual impulse. Sources suggest that the Stoics called this hexis hormetike. When this is negative, it is, Barlaam argues, the worst possible condition of the mind. False opinions are not far behind insofar as they generate harmful impulses. But the least detrimental of the three is mental darkness or emotional disturbance, a negative emotion. And while the Stoics are widely associated with a strident rejection of such negative emotions, Barlaam argues that although ideally they're to be avoided, they're far from being the worst thing to befall the mind. If one has true opinions and a favorable will, then even with some emotional disturbance, overall, the mind will be in a good condition. Impulses are far more important to attend to than emotions, he argues, because they're the things that determine how we behave and act in the world. Now, having said that a harmful will is the worst of these three traits of the mind, Barlaam goes on to draw distinctions between two types of harmful will, and mirroring this, two types of favorable will. The distinction he wants to draw is between a bad impulse caused by a sudden emotional disturbance, such as someone lashing out in anger, and a more ingrained bad impulse that persists over time and is not the product of any immediate stimulus. And the latter, of course, is much worse. And it's this that he has in mind when he argues that a harmful will is the worst trait to have. It is, he says, something rooted in the soul. And again, this sounds like an ingrained habitual impulse. Someone who's developed a habit of lashing out at people in anger is evidently in a much worse condition than someone who does so only on odd occasions under extreme provocation. And a similar distinction can apply in the case of having a favorable will. We can draw a distinction between an occasional positive outburst of, say, charity, and a lasting positive habit of good actions based on reason. And again, he characterizes the second as something implanted in the soul. And while occasional acts are obviously good, they're spontaneous and sporadic. The latter, by contrast, embodies the sort of consistency of behavior that the Stoics associate with virtuous action. Okay, so with that clarification made about what Barlaam has in mind between when he talks about a harmful will or a favorable will, they can come in two different types. He moves on to consider the relationship between these three different sets of traits. And it's worth stressing that although he presents these as three distinct traits, they're all in fact closely interconnected. As we've just seen, a harmful will can be the product of emotional disturbance, namely mental darkness, as he calls it. An ingrained harmful will, understood as a bad habitual impulse, is presumably the product of repeated emotional disturbances. Similarly, these disturbances are what cloud the mind, leading it to make false judgments in the first place, and so hold false opinions. Conversely, we might say that holding a false opinion will lead to an emotional disturbance. So judgments and opinions, mental darkness, disturbance, bad habitual impulses, these three things all look quite as if they're quite closely interconnected with each other, according to standard Stoic thinking. Now, unsurprisingly, the best mental state will involve all three of these positive traits: true opinion or judgment, mental evenness, and a favorable will. When these three things all agree, we attain a state of constancy, constantia. Now, Barlaam uses the word constantia that we're all familiar with already from our Stoic sources. But what does he have in mind when he uses this term? In the Tusculan Disputations, Cicero uses constantiae to describe the three positive emotional states that our Greek sources call eupatheiai. However, as Margaret Graver has commented, this is a potentially misleading translation by Cicero, not to mention inconsistent with how he uses these terms elsewhere. Just a few paragraphs earlier in the same work, Cicero had used constantia in its more usual sense to mean something like consistency of mind. And it's in this later sense that Seneca uses constantia throughout his works. In his letters, Seneca lists constantia as a virtue, alongside other virtues such as tranquility and simplicity. And Seneca connects this virtue with good judgment and true opinion, which puts him in line with what Barlaam seems to have in mind. Seneca also says that as a virtue, constantia is something that cannot be improved further. He says, constancy cannot advance further. What can be added to that which is perfect? Nothing. The ability to increase is proof that a thing is still imperfect. And again, that seems to be in line with Barlaam's presentation of constantia as the mind in a perfect state. So at first glance then, it looks as if Barlaam is using constantia in what we might call the Senecan sense of the term, rather than the Ciceronian sense that tends to dominate in scholarly discussions of Stoic emotions. But I want to return to that issue a bit later on as well. Okay, so the perfect state of constantia, according to Barlaam, arises when all three of these positive traits are present. Now, that's presumably a rare occurrence. It may be that none of these positive traits are present, or perhaps just one or two. The absence or presence of each of these states generates a total of 8 possible combinations. The perfect state of constantia and 7 further combinations. 4 of these combinations will involve the absence of mental evenness, which is to say, mental darkness. And as we've seen, this is equivalent to negative emotion. So there are 4 different types of negative emotion, according to Barlaam, defined by the presence or absence of the 2 other traits. So the worst type of mental of emotional disturbance is when mental darkness is combined with false opinion and a harmful will. The least damaging is when mental darkness is combined with true opinion and a favorable will. And between these are 2 further states where mental darkness is combined with 1 positive, 1 negative trait. And later, Barlaam will rank these, prioritizing the presence of favorable will over true opinion. As one can see, mental disturbance or emotional disturbance is not an all or nothing affair. It can be better or worse, depending on the absence of these 2 other traits. Okay, so we've got a 4-fold division of emotions, but quite different from the standard account based on positive and negative judgments that we saw at the beginning. Okay, I said there were a total of 8 different combinations. We have constantia, the ideal, these 4 different types of emotional disturbance. That leaves 3 further possible combinations. These are not states of emotional disturbance, but they're nevertheless imperfect because of the presence of either false opinion or a harmful will. And Barlaam gives each of these a specific name. And for two of them, the name he gives them involves the transliteration of a Greek word. And the presence of these transliterated Greek words, eleutherotes and aphelia, might be taken for the claim that Barlaam is drawing on a Greek source here, perhaps something that he encountered in Constantinople, or even one of the monasteries of southern Italy. Although, of course, it's possible he could have been drawing on some Latin source that contained odd words of Greek, such as we're familiar from Cicero's works. The order in which Barlaam introduces these three states starts with the worst, what he calls insanity or foolishness, and ends with the least objectionable, simplicity. And as we've seen, all three benefit from mental evenness. So these are not states of emotional disturbance. Simplicity is the best because it involves a favorable will, and that's always preferable over a harmful will, even when the latter is combined with true opinion. Insanity is unambiguously the worst because it involves both a harmful will and false opinion. As we saw a moment ago, Barlaam ranks in order the four states of emotional disturbance. The worst obviously involves a harmful will and false opinion. So again, in both rankings, Barlaam prioritizes having a favorable will as being something more important than having true opinions. Okay, so the account of emotional disturbances I've just outlined, based on the combination of these three different traits, is quite different, as I said, from the standard account I outlined at the beginning, reported by Cicero, Diogenes Laertius, and Aristodemus. That account, as we saw, involved a fourfold division, but quite different from the one that Barlaam makes. Barlaam's account at first glance is clearly not the Stoic account. However, he goes on to complicate matters by introducing what he calls another division of the same things. And what he outlines is, more or less, the standard account that we're already familiar with, although with one interesting variation. Every emotional disturbance, he says, is a mental darkness derived from an opinion or belief in something either good or evil. Such good and evil things can be not merely present or future, as the standard account says, but past, present, or future. The belief in something evil, either past or present, he calls distress, while one anticipating the future is called fear or dread. Belief in something good, either past or present, is called pleasure. And belief in an anticipated good in the future is called desire. The inclusion of beliefs about past goods and evils will have a significant consequence when we turn to the topic of eupathei, good emotions, a little later on. Now, both in terms of structure and terminology, as you can see on the slide, this second fourfold division outlined by Barlaam is largely the same as the standard account. So what we find in Barlaam's text is both a completely new fourfold division of Stoic emotions and the standard account. Now, his next really striking move is to combine these two fourfold accounts, arguing that the four different types of emotional disturbance set out in the standard account can be varied according to his fourfold division. He takes the example of mercy, which he defines as distress caused by an opinion or belief that someone else is being oppressed by an injustice. This is one type of emotional disturbance that falls into the category of those things caused by a belief in a present evil. This disturbance or mental darkness might be based on a true opinion that someone is indeed suffering unjustly, but it could equally be based on a mistake, such as a false report. Both of those possibilities might be conjoined with a favorable will that impels someone to act for the benefit of the injured person, or supposedly injured if it's based on a false opinion. Or it could alternatively be combined with a harmful will, which renders the agent too lazy or indifferent to intervene. In sum, there's not one emotional state of mercy, but four, varied through these different combinations of traits. And the same will apply to many other emotions, Barlaam says. So combining these two different fourfold divisions together in this way generates a total of 16 different emotional states. Now, this obviously takes us well beyond the four states that we're familiar with from the standard account. Yet perhaps it ought not to come as too much of a surprise, because in the summary account of the standard view that we find in Arius Didymus, for instance, we're told that some emotions are primary and fundamental, while others are secondary. And the four emotions outlined in the standard account are, he says, the primary ones. And so perhaps we ought to expect some kind of system that will explain the other subdivisions into secondary emotions. Arius Didymus goes on to list some of the emotions that are subsumed under the four primary types and offers us some descriptions of them. In order to get a sense, maybe we'll just focus on one of the four types. So Arius Didymus reports that under the primary emotion of fear, there are subsumed the secondary emotions of hesitancy, anguish, astonishment, shame, commotion, superstition, dread, and terror. He only gives a brief description of each of these secondary emotions. So for instance, he says, hesitancy is fear about future activity. Anguish is fear of failure and fear of defeat. Astonishment is fear arising from an unaccustomed impression. Shame is fear of loss of reputation. Commotion is fear together with noise urging us on. Superstition is fear of the gods, and so on. Now, we find similar lists and descriptions of secondary emotions arranged under the primary emotion of fear in Diogenes, Laertius, and Cicero too. And despite variations between these three sources regarding which emotions they describe, they all broadly take the same form. The important point to note in the present context is that none of these ancient lists attempt to differentiate between these secondary emotions with reference to opinion and will in the way that Barlaam's account does. If Barlaam's account genuinely reflects some aspect of ancient Stoic thinking that's otherwise lost, then it seems to be reporting something quite distinct from what all of the other ancient sources recount. Now, Barlaam himself resists listing secondary emotions in the way that our ancient sources do, simply saying there are many and various species of each genus, which it's not necessary to discuss in the present work. Now, this comment might be taken to imply that he was familiar with at least one of the ancient lists. However, he does mention a few secondary emotions as examples of ones that cannot be varied according to his first fourfold division, in the way that that example of mercy could be that we discussed a moment ago. These ones that cannot be varied occur, he says, in those who combine mental darkness with false opinion and a harmful will. Now, as it happens, he doesn't mention any under the genus of fear, but under distress, he mentions envy and jealousy. And under pleasure, he notes spite, boasting, pride, and under desire, he notes enmity and discord. These emotions, he says, always proceed from a false opinion and a harmful will. And although he doesn't spell out the details, his examples seem to fit very well in the context of his model. So, for instance, the emotions of envy and jealousy sound as if they would require a harmful will as a precondition. Okay, so almost all of these secondary emotions that Barlaam mentions feature in the fuller list that we find in Cicero in the Tusculan Disputations. So there's some common ground between what Barlaam reports and the ancient lists. However, all of the ancient lists that do survive differ from one another, and none of them is especially organized or claim to be complete. And although they offer definitions of each secondary emotion, none of them really give us a systematic account of how these are supposed to differ from one another. Barlaam's model looks to do precisely that, offer us an account of how they differ from one another. But with only partial and incomplete summaries to compare it against, it's very difficult to assess how plausible it is that Barlaam's model reflects ancient Stoic material. So yeah, that was the. Okay, so let's move on to say something about good emotions, eupathei. Earlier in his discussion, as I mentioned, Barlaam had defined constantia as an ideal state that arises when all three positive traits, true opinion, mental evenness, and a favorable will, are all present. And as I noted earlier, that seems to be quite different from the sense in which Cicero used constantia when he offered it as a translation for eupathei in the Tusculan Disputations. On his account, there are three types of constantiae, namely joy, wishing, and caution. Our Greek sources name these, supply the Greek names for these. Now, earlier when I touched on this, I suggested that Barlaam was probably using constantia in the sense used by Seneca, referring to a virtuous mental state, namely having a consistent and unwavering mind. Now, however, in the light of Barlaam's incorporation of the standard account into his discussion, Barlaam suggests that constantia will vary according to how it relates to the temporal variety of goods and evils, namely, whether something good or bad is past, present, or future. Now, this suggests that Barlaam is using constantia in a way that shares something in common with Cicero's use of the term, after all, because the eupathei vary in precisely this way. According to the standard account, the three eupathei come about in the following way. Joy is a rational elation prompted by the presence of something good. Caution is a rational avoidance prompted by the anticipation of something bad. And wishing is a rational appetite prompted by the anticipation of something good. Thus, eupatheia or constantia, as Cicero translates it, varies according to the temporal variety of goods and evils, just as Barlaam states. And the parallels become even clearer when we attend to the terminology used by both Barlaam and Cicero. So it seems clear then that Barlaam is using constantia in the sense that Cicero does to refer to the eupathei, but he's also defining it as a combination of the three positive traits: true opinion, mental evenness, and a favorable will. One might say that to be in a state of constantia is, as Seneca describes it, to be in an ideal state of consistency and steadfastness. And as a virtuous state, it's not one that can vary in degree, but it can vary in type along the lines mapped out here. So does Barlaam offer a solution to the puzzling way in which Cicero uses constantia in two different senses? I'll just ask that question. Now, the one really striking difference between the accounts that we find in Cicero and the one in Barlaam is, of course, that Cicero lists only 3 eupathei, whereas Barlaam lists 4. Cicero is in line here with the standard account. And as I mentioned earlier, the usual explanation for why there's no 4th eupathei is that insofar as these are states experienced by a sage, there's never a situation in which a virtuous sage directly experiences anything genuinely evil. They have no evil within themselves, being virtuous, and they judge no experience or object to be evil because they know that however unpleasant something might be, at worst, it's merely a non-preferred indifferent. As Cicero put it, the sage is not affected by present evil. In Barlaam's account, however, we're dealing with a category that covers not just present evils, but both past and present evils. And while the ideal sage might be free of evil right now, there was presumably a time when they'd not reached this state of moral perfection. And such a person might reflect back on the past and their own previous non-virtuous behavior and feel a sense of shame or regret for their past actions before they became a sage. And Barlaam suggests that in those sorts of circumstances, the sage will experience the emotion of regret. And this will be a good emotion because it will be a rational response to the circumstances. In other words, the sage ought to feel the emotion of regret for past mistakes they made before they attained wisdom. Now, at first glance, that seems to contradict our ancient sources. Arius Didymus reports that it will be the non-sage who experiences regret, while Seneca says that the sage never experiences regret, because nothing better could have been done at the time than was done at that moment. Now, there's no reason in principle where these two statements might not be reconciled with what Barlaam says, for he's considering a very special case of a sage reflecting back on their earlier actions when they were imperfect. But one could certainly imagine someone like Seneca coming back and arguing that even in this scenario, whatever was done seemed to be the best thing to do at the time, even if the decision was compromised by a lack of knowledge or understanding. After all, the Stoics are committed to the Socratic claim that wrongdoing is the product of ignorance. And a sage who fully understands this, one might argue, would have no grounds to feel regret for past mistakes, given that they know that that was all they could have done in those particular circumstances. Barlaam mentions a couple of other good emotions that fall into this category of responses to past or present evils. One of them is pity, which he defines as a response to past or present evils happening to others. And it's worth noting that he explicitly says that this can apply to both the past and the present. So his claim is that it's perfectly rational for a sage to feel pity at the plight of others. And that seems to be in direct contradiction to ancient reports of the Stoic position, which consistently classify pity as a species of distress and one of the 4 primary categories to be avoided. Indeed, Cicero explicitly says that the sage will not feel pity precisely because it's a species of distress, while Seneca offers an extended polemic against pity. And the second one here is even more unexpected: anger, ira. which Barlaam defines as a response to evils done by another in the past. Here, there's no explicit mention of the present. And what it seems to imply is that although it would be inappropriate for a sage to become angry in the present moment, there is room for some form of what one might call righteous anger over past injustices perpetrated by other people. And in both of these two cases, anger and pity, it looks like we've got really significant departures from what we'd expect a Stoic account of the emotions to say. Okay, so having explained these different types of emotional disturbances and good emotions, Barlaam's next move is to set out his entire account. And let's jump forwards to this. So for any given emotion, he says there will be 5 degrees. There will be 4 degrees of emotional disturbance, and there will be 1 degree of good emotion, constantia, at the top. The other 3 states mentioned by Barlaam that we outlined earlier, malice, insanity, simplicity, he says are worse than being in a state of emotional disturbance. Someone not hampered in their judgment by the fog of an emotion, who still has false opinions, or even worse, a harmful will have even less excuse for their poor behavior. The person, we might say, who is calmly malevolent is clearly morally worse than someone who lashes out in a temporary fit of anger. The worst thing Barlaam's order assumes is to have a harmful will, namely deeply ingrained bad habits. These persist over time in the way that being overcome by an emotional disturbance doesn't. Seneca famously describes anger as a temporary madness. For Barlaam, an ingrained malevolent disposition is what we might call permanent madness. So on his account, being in a state of an emotional disturbance is not the worst state that you can be in. So these 3 states rank even lower down. Okay, to wrap things up, let me say a little bit about where all of this might be coming from. Potential sources. If any of what I've just outlined is genuine, and that is a big if, where might it have come from? What was Barlaam reading? What could he have been reading in the libraries of Constantinople, or indeed southern Italy? Well, first, I think it's perhaps worth noting various things that we know that have been lost. Here are just a couple of examples of texts that we know existed in Barlaam's day, but have since gone. Just a couple of decades before Barlaam arrived in Constantinople, William of Murbecker translated a number of short texts by Proclus into Latin, the Tria Opuscula. Now, the Greek originals that William of Murbecker used are now lost, and his Latin version is the only witness we have. And at the same time, Petrarch reported in one of his letters to have owned a copy of Cicero's now lost work, De Gloria, which had been in his father's possession. And we have evidence of a number of other texts that survived into the early 1300s that are now gone. Potentially, Barlaam could have read a range of things that have since been lost. In one of his works, he refers to a number of Pythagoreans. A couple of the names that he cites are names that aren't attested anywhere else. One of the names that he does cite, a Pythagorean called Brotinus, our only information for him comes from the commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics by Syrianus. And that commentary by Syrianus survives incomplete. Only 4 books of it survive. So it's been suggested perhaps Barlaam had access to the entirety of this commentary on the Metaphysics by Syrianus, and that his knowledge of all of the various Pythagoreans he mentions at this place in one of his other works came from that. Another point where he may have had access to a text that's since been lost. Now, obviously, a commentary like that on Aristotle's metaphysics is hardly going to be a source for Stoic ethics or emotions. A slightly different source of evidence can be found in the works of Boccaccio, who I mentioned at the beginning. At 3 different places in Boccaccio's genealogy of the pagan gods, Boccaccio cites material from Chrysippus, explicitly saying that his information came from Paolo of Perugia, the librarian in Naples. And if this information didn't come from readily available Latin sources, then what was Paolo drawing on? Well, it's been argued that it may have come from Greek sources relayed to Paolo by Barlaam. Could this be taken as evidence that Barlaam had access to material by Chrysippus, or at least material reporting the views of Chrysippus that's no longer accessible to us? It seemed highly unlikely that a complete work by Chrysippus would have survived to the 14th century. I don't think anyone would want to suggest that. But perhaps some intermediate source reporting material by Chrysippus is a more realistic possibility. As I say, Boccaccio reports claims by Chrysippus not attested anywhere else. He was getting that information from somewhere, assuming he wasn't just making it up. So that looks like a possible line where we have a hint that Barlaam had access to Stoic material, otherwise unknown. However, despite that, we should perhaps sound a more cautionary note. This can be found in a work by one of Barlaam's direct contemporaries, the Byzantine humanist Theodore Metakaites, and he says the following. He writes, the Stoics were most influential in the Hellenistic period and later Heroic times under the emperors, when the Christian faith first began to illuminate human life in the whole of the civilized world. The Stoics were in opposition both to Aristotle and to his disciples and followers, the Peripatetics, and they were extremely influential, more so than all the other adherents of different schools. They flourished greatly and were well armed, and they thought very highly of themselves because of the multitude of their adherents and writings. But all this is gone, completely vanquished by the wisdom of Aristotle. Nothing remains whatsoever. Nothing is left of their writings. It is as if they had never existed. Right now, Metakaites is obviously being polemical here. He wants to say the Stoics have been wiped off the face of the earth by the Aristotelians. But nevertheless, he's quite explicitly saying there are no Stoic texts left. So, who's correct? Is Metakaites right in saying that the works of the Stoics are completely gone? Was Barlaam lying when he said that his account came from the books of the Stoics themselves? Is he reporting some aspect of genuine Stoic theory? Or did he just make it all up? Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much. Now,
and one last slide for you.
Yes.
If you're curious, an edition of this text with an English translation will be coming out in September.
Oh, very nice. Very nice. Could you please send me the reference?
Yes, I will do.
So this will be out this year?
This year, in September.
In September, so, yes, I see.
Yeah,
yes.
Okay. Yeah, a few months.
Oh, very interesting. Well, thank you very much. Very, very interesting. So, if it's okay, we can ask some questions and discuss a little bit your talk. Then Andre.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I have a number of questions, but I'll limit myself to just to 2 of them. Barlaam, of course, knows very well the Greek sources, right? But I was wondering the weight, if any, that Cicero's views on terminology regarding emotions had in Barlaam. That's my first question. And the other one is, I was also wondering if Barlaam found the correspondence
all of other Barlaam's surviving works in theology, philosophy, astronomy are all in Greek, but this text survives in Latin. And the assumption is that it was written in Latin. And the further assumption is that it was probably written towards the end of his life when he was in contact with Petrarch, and would have been written in Latin so that Petrarch could read it. And of course, Petrarch, in his own works, when he's discussing Stoic emotions, is drawing very heavily on Cicero. So, I mean, again, this is just all we can do is speculate. But it's tempting to assume that the two of them may well have been discussing Stoic emotions, and Cicero would have been a key point of reference. So I suspect that he probably was drawing on Cicero in what he's writing here, and that would explain much of the terminological correspondence. But it's interesting that every so often he'll throw in some other terms that we don't find in Cicero, and we'll say these are roughly equivalent. And I mean, it's tempting to think that that might be where he's translating from some other Greek source that covers the same ground. And as I mentioned in a couple of places, there are a couple of points where rather than translate, he just transliterates Greek terms, suggesting he's working from some Greek source, perhaps alongside Cicero.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, as for your second question, I'll just see if I can find the relevant slide. It was a remind
to repentance or regret, but I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I can't see that quickly. I'm afraid. Yes, so lupe, distress, right?
It's linked to repentance and regret. Is that
Oh,
correct?
yes.
That was my point.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So, yes. So, the key point there would be that his category is going to cover not just present evils, but also past and present evils. So you're not just making so in the standard account, you're just making judgments about whether anything bad is present right now. But he's suggesting that you could also make judgments about things that happened in the past, and then that might lead to the idea of experiencing regret, right?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so is there anything you want to add, Marcelo?
No, thank you. Thank you so much. It's okay.
Okay, André Lax, please.
Hi, thank you very much. The question is about one of your slides also, where you when you say that there are transcriptions, Latin transcriptions of Greek terms, and I didn't get the Greek terms actually. So I would like you to the transcriptions seemed weird to me, and so I would like you to say something about the original Greek words of which the transcriptions are a transcription.
Yes, thank you. So again, I'm just seeing if I can quickly find the relevant slide so I could put it up for everyone.
Yeah, that would be useful.
Here we go. So I'll quickly share my screen again.
Good.
Here we go.
Yes.
So yes, so insanity. Oops, sorry. Insanity, elithiotes, and simplicity.
But so elithiotes with an epsilon, with an eta. I can't get the. I don't have the word in my. And Vesania, what is this?
Yeah, I'll just. Here we go. So. Yeah, eta, lambda, iota, theta, iota, omicron.
But yeah, so
tau,
it's a iota after the.
Yes.
Eli. Okay, and Vesania?
No, that's I don't think that's a transcription from the Greek.
Ah, okay. But I am baffled because I have the little scotch under my eye here. So elitiazzo, foolish. Okay.
Yeah.
Elithiotes. And aphelia, simplicitas.
Yeah. So alpha, phi, epsilon.
Aphelia. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think a huge amount hangs on those two terms in particular. I think just what's striking is that rather than use Latin words, he's just sort of tried to transliterate these two Greek terms. And as you can see, he offers other Latin terms to describe these states. He could have just used Vesania, simplicitas, not bothered with these transcriptions of these Greek words. The fact that he's included them just suggests that he's drawing on a Greek source. I mean, so that's really the only point that I want to make about them. I mean, that's just.
May I ask a question about? I mean, is there in the kind of text that he's writing an indication that he's really reporting? I mean, is it a clear report, or could it be a paraphrase or a comment, a free commentary? I don't have any clue about the kind of writing that it is. And I mean, does he say, the Stoics say that, or is there any indication that he's reporting? That would be the very naive question.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of places where he makes arguments that are of a similar sort to what we find in other works by him. So I think the text is very much in his own voice, but he says that he's drawing on he's drawing on sources. There's one very striking bit at the very end of the text where he reports the view of Theophrastus, and he argues against Theophrastus and says, the Stoic view is better. And because he mentions Theophrastus, it's exerted by William Fortenbaugh and team in the big Theophrastus project. And in Fortenbaugh's commentary on this passage, he's very dismissive, and he says, well, this clearly doesn't report the genuine views of Theophrastus. It's garbled and confused. What this reads like is a later Stoic account of Theophrastus's view that isn't particularly accurate or charitable. And so that makes it tempting to suggest that when Barlaam talks about Theophrastus there, he's probably drawing on the same source that he's drawing for the rest of the Stoic material from, right? Which outlines some Stoic ideas and then outlines some Stoic objections to Theophrastus, right?
Thank you.
Is there anything you want to add, André?
No, that's fine. Thank you very much.
Okay. Very well. So, Paloma?
Thank you very much for your talk. It's very, very interesting author. I just have a little question. Is there any possibility that some of the sources are Arabic or Arabic translation into Latin?
I'll just stop sharing my screen for the minute. That's very interesting. I don't think there is, to be honest. I don't think there's any evidence that he knew Arabic. So it's not obvious that he would be able to access that kind of material. Although, of course, growing up in Calabria, he's just over, very close to Sicily, which was obviously, a great multilingual center of learning. But also, I guess, there's not much evidence for there being a lot of Stoic doxography in the Arabic tradition generally, right? I think the general view is by the time the Greco-Arabic translation movement gets going, probably, what's already lost of Stoic material was already gone by that point. And so, yeah, so that I think that's perhaps a less likely place where we might find something.
Okay, thank you very much.
Marcelo, would you like to ask another question, or is that the hand you raised earlier?
Yes, I have 1,000 questions, but
okay.
No, I have a very general question. In case one might reconstruct Barlaam's version, Stoic Emotions, in detail, I was thinking, to what extent does he preserve the basic aspects of the Orthodox doctrine of emotions? What are, in your view, the most remarkable developments that in any case allow us to continue to say that Barlaam is a Stoic in a certain sense? Well, that's my third question.
No, thank you. So it's, I mean, so he as I say, he reports the standard account, or a version of the standard account, right? So again, you could imagine someone trying to read it like this. You could say, well, he presents this completely new fourfold division. Maybe that's coming from some Greek source and we don't know what that source is. And then he presents the standard account, the one that we're familiar with. And as we were discussing a moment ago, maybe he borrows that from someone like Cicero. And then Barlaam's creative bit is to kind of stick the two together, right? But the way in which it's all worked out seems odd. It seems odd that that would be all his work, right? And also it seems odd it would be odd to claim that he's taking the standard account directly from Cicero, even if he's read Cicero, because of this variation about past and present rather than just present goods and evils, and the introduction of this fourth eupathei. So it's incredibly difficult. It doesn't look like any of it is coming from our standard sources, but there's a clear overlap with what we're familiar with as Stoic doctrine. He's quite explicit that this is an account of Stoic doctrine, and he's also quite explicit that it's coming from the works of the Stoics. So on a number of other points, I think he's fairly orthodox in his Stoicism. So I've not talked about the first book of this two-book work. And in the first book, it's a strident defense of the idea that virtue is the only good. And the Aristotelian alternative isn't quite right. And so that, the first book looks kind of more straightforwardly orthodox Stoic doctrine as well. So I think there's lots of orthodox Stoicism within this work, as well as this other material, you know, some of which we might be able to reconcile with what we already know. The more finer grained system of divisions might in theory be reconciled. But then there are these other additions that just looks, you know, a bit more problematic, particularly this idea of the sage experiencing pity or anger, which just to us sounds strikingly non-Stoic. But you know, it's very difficult to know whether we can kind of pick and mix and decide which bits we think look plausible whilst rejecting other bits, if it's all supposed to be coming from the same source. So it's a real mystery. I mean, I'm far from having a firm view on this yet as to what, if any, of this might be believable. But it's the earliest text that we have discussing Stoicism after antiquity, right? So contemporary with Petrarch, right at the beginning of the Italian Renaissance. So it's this kind of significant moment in the history of the reception of Stoic ethics. And some of it is certainly clearly Stoic, even if other bits might come from a questionable source.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, very clear. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcelo. We have two more questions so far, one by Davis Dennis. The other is a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see it, John, by Bart van Fassenhoven. And the third question would be from Georgia Murutsu. So Davis, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Sayer. Professor Sellars, thank you very much for interesting communication. I'd like to ask you whether you truly believe that Barlaam's opinion stemmed from, for instance, Chrysippus, or rather from a Latinized or vulgarized Stoic sources.
Yeah, thank you. I'm fairly skeptical about the idea that this comes directly from Chrysippus, right? Not least because,
right,
if this did come directly from Chrysippus, surely Cicero would have reported it, right? Or surely there would be a bit more in Cicero that would connect more directly with this, right? Cicero would have had access to pretty much everything, so that seems unlikely. Other people have pointed to the so-called Middle Stoics, maybe someone like Posidonius. I think that's fairly unlikely too, because I think if Posidonius had developed an account of the emotions quite different from Chrysippus, then surely Galen would have jumped on that, or Plutarch for that matter, but Galen in particular, in order to highlight more divisions and contradictions amongst the Stoics. So that seems unlikely as well. One Stoic text that we know circulated in Byzantium for quite a while, but has since been lost, is the second half of the discourses of Epictetus. And, you know, Photius describes, Photius, I think, describes 8 books, of which we have 4. The problem with that as a suggestion is that the account that Barlaam gives is very, very technical. And it's not the sort of thing that it's not the sort of an account that we would expect to find in something like the discourses of Epictetus, which for the most part aren't particularly technical at all.
So your opinion is?
I still don't, I don't know yet. I honestly don't know. This is early days.
Okay.
I honestly don't know. Someone has suggested to me maybe a work of a church father who took up and adapted some Stoic ideas and changed them in some way, a Greek church father, someone like Origen, perhaps. But you know, a work by Origen certainly wouldn't be a work by the Stoics. But might Origen have presented a version of the Stoic account, claimed it was genuine, but in fact misrepresented it? I mean, but again, I mean, we're in the realms of speculation.
So it could be a vulgarized or Latinized source.
That seems more likely than something really stretching right back to antiquity.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Davis. Now, John, well, Bart, is Bart here? Would you like to ask your question yourself, Bart? I don't, okay. So I think
I'm just reading through it now.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question about shame and how that fits in to the emotional state of the sage. I would need to check the text to see whether it's explicitly mentioned in Barlaam, but I certainly will. But my first thought is that seems like it would fit quite well within Barlaam's account, because you could imagine the sage feeling shame, like regret, for actions in the past before they'd attained wisdom. So, I mean, it looks like it could work in terms of the system, but I'll have a look and see if he mentions it explicitly.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, it is a very good question indeed. So, Georgia?
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I'm particularly surprised by the reference to the past, which I find a uniquely distinct element, given what we have about the Stoics, but also their interesting grammar in the differentiation of the present continuous and the present perfect. Could it be, just an hypothesis, that we have a Platonic element? So he's clearly expressing views against Aristotle or Theophrastus. Could it be that there is a Platonic element? Can we somehow find evidence for any of the two options, or is this simply impossible?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. He doesn't refer explicitly to lots of Platonic texts that would kind of make it overt, but that's obviously that's obviously part of the intellectual climate in which he's working. Petrarch makes a point of saying, in fact, I think it was one of the passages on one of the slides, that he's seen a collection of Plato's dialogues in Barlaam's possession, right? So Barlaam brings this codex of Platonic dialogues with him to Italy. So he's certainly reading Plato. The other person who's a key point of reference for him in his theological works is Pseudo-Dionysius, and that tradition of kind of Neoplatonic negative theology. So there's certainly a kind of what we might call a Neoplatonic strain within his thought. So I would say he's sympathetic to the Platonic tradition for sure, and that, yeah, that, I mean, that could certainly have shaped the way that he approached this material.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Georgia. Any more questions? No? Well, I have a couple of questions, if I may. One of them is this: is about the eupatheia. As you pointed out, there are 3 eupatheia in Stoicism, but 4 in Barlaam. And the now, my question is this: well, the standard Stoic account doesn't have an eupatheia for the perception of evil in the present. They do have one for the perception of evil in the future, which is caution, and the bad emotional analog of that would be fear. And but the standard account doesn't have an eupatheia for the perception of evil in the present. Now, Barlaam doesn't have one either, does he? Because when he his 4th eupatheia is for the perception of evil in the past, mainly. And why is that? Because the new eupatheia that he introduces is repentance, or regret. But repentance or regret are things, are attitudes, that are directed towards the past. I mean, you do not repent from something that you are doing. I mean, you can repent from something that you did, or you can have some regret for having done something in the past. So then this 4th eupatheia introduced by Barlaam doesn't really fill the gap that is left by the standard account, which is what's missing from the standard account is and the gap that is left by Barlaam is an eupatheia for the perception of evil in the present. So my question here is twofold. One is, why do you think? I mean, what are the philosophical reasons, according to you, John, that may have led the ancient Stoics to omit, to omit an eupatheia directed at the evil in the present? And I mean, why didn't they didn't propose an eupatheia for that? And the second question is, I mean, would you agree that when Barlaam speaks of repentance and regret, he's dealing with the perception of evil in the past only? Or do you think that, according to Barlaam, repentance and regret are directed towards the present, which would be a bit odd, from a philosophical point of view, because we don't have regret or repentance for something in the present.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, in terms of how the ancient Stoics justify having just 3 of these states. I mean, in the talk I outlined, I think was probably the most common explanation, which is that these are affective states experienced by the sage, and if the sage is perfectly virtuous, then they contain no vice within them, so there's nothing genuinely bad present for a sage. So that would be the reason why. I did read something recently that tried to challenge that view. The author escapes me, but I think that's probably the most common way in which people have tried to explain that, and that seems plausible. So I mean that would be why I think there's no 4th eupatheia for the ancient Stoics. Vice isn't present in the mind of the sage. As for your other comments about Barlaam, I mean, I agree with you entirely. Something like regret sounds like it's only focused on the past and isn't something that would be relevant to the present. So I think that I would agree with you there. I think that makes good sense. However, in that category, he lists 3 or 4 different emotions that fall under that subheading. And one of the others that he lists under that subheading alongside regret is pity, potentially even more problematic in a Stoic context. And he says that pity is, I mean, he says explicitly, pity can relate to both the past and the present. Evils that have happened to others who either have suffered or are suffering, right?
Yes. Okay.
So that would be direct, right? Now, if this is a good emotion experienced by a sage, it's going to have to be based on a correct judgment. Yeah. So that this can't be pity for general adversity or bad luck in life, right? The experiencing of non-preferable circumstances. Presumably, if it's a correct judgment, it's going to be situations where someone's virtue is being challenged, right? Presumably that would count as an appropriate time for a sage to feel pity, right? But that's my first thought, at least.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. If I'm going to ask another question. Well, one is a comment on your reply to my first question. Then, I mean, if you say that the Stoics, the ancient Stoics, the standard account doesn't have an account, I mean, they do not have an eupatheia for the perception of evil in the present because there are no evils, the same problem would arise for the future, no? Because you could say that, I mean, there are no evils in the future either. I mean, nothing is evil. I mean, unless you're dealing with vice or something like that. No, but the Stoics would say that, well, if I was insulted, for example, well, or if I will be insulted, no, which is something that tends in the future. Well, this insult is not something bad, so I shouldn't have caution regarding that the person that will eventually insult me. No, but yes, I see that. I see that. Okay. Now, my other group of questions has to do with the following. You have shown that Barlaam has an account of the emotions, in which he distinguishes 4 grades at least of emotional disturbance, plus 1 type of eupatheia, if I understood well, which is let's focus on bad emotions. No, so he has four grades of emotional disturbance, and these, and the difference between them is that each of them is a different combination of bad traits. No, and the three traits are they are true or false opinion, well, false opinion in this case, mental darkness, and unfavorable or no, bad will. No, so each of the four emotional disturbances is a different combination of these three. Or two, or one, two, or three, no, of these traits. So, right. So, I mean, my first impression is that this classification of emotions is a classification of emotions in terms of the mental states, so to speak, that they involve. No. Now, well, so that's one thing. Now, the standard account of the emotions is not really, well, as far as I understand, is not really a classification of the emotions in terms of the mental states that they involve, but rather in terms of their objects. You know, so when the evil, I mean, when the emotion is directed towards something good, and present or future or past, no, so it has to do with the kind of object that the emotion is directed towards, not so much, I mean, the division is not made so much in terms of the mental states that they involve. So these are two different ways of classifying the emotions, and of course they are complementary. No? I mean, they complement each other, or they may complement each other, and this is exactly what Barlaam does when you said that Barlaam combines the two classifications, no? And so Barlaam does refer to the standard account and shows how the standard account can be combined with his own account of the emotions. But his own account of the emotions is not itself Stoic. Or is there any evidence that this fourfold division of mental disturbances that Barlaam proposes, is there any evidence that this fourfold division goes back to the Stoics?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this is the big question, right? Yes. And there are various little bits, various little parallels.
Yes.
Where, so when he's talking about good or bad impulses and ingrained habits, this kind of connects with odd little bits of information that we have about the role of habits in Stoicism. But of course, our evidence is so fragmentary that, you know, that all of that work on Stoic moral psychology is you know, very, very difficult to reconstruct.
Yes.
So, but you know, and then the idea that true or false opinions based on correct or incorrect judgments, I mean, that feels like a fairly standard Stoic thing, right? You want your true opinions based on correct judgments. You don't want to be in a bad habitual state, because that's going to generate bad actions. That kind of sounds a bit Stoic too.
Yes.
So, and then you've got the account of the emotions, which look fairly Stoic. So yeah, there are all sorts of tantalizing points of connection.
Yes.
But there's nothing in any of the other sources that we've got that put it all together in the way that he does.
Yes, exactly.
So there's nothing to corroborate his account.
So this, I mean, this way of combining all these concepts, which are present in early Stoicism, this way of combining them, that may be his contribution, his own contribution to the theory of emotions, you think? Or at least we don't have evidence that there is someone earlier that used these concepts to classify the emotions in that way. That we don't have.
We don't have that I have found.
Yeah.
So that leaves us two options, right? One option is that he is reporting some fuller account that's since been lost.
Yeah.
The other option is that he's actually a really smart philosopher who has pulled together all this fragmentary information and actually tried to synthesize it and make some sense of it all. And, you know, which is less interesting for those of us interested in ancient Stoicism, in the sense that he's not reporting anything new, but shows him to be a very creative and interesting thinker who's trying to make sense out of the bits of information that he's recovered. So, you know, I mean, that would be to his credit that he's tried to do this.
Yes. No. Yes. Very much. Very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have another question, but Edgar has a question too. Edgar.
Yes. Thanks, John, for the very interesting talk. I just had a doubt, and I just wanted you to explain to me a bit more about the distinction. I mean, once you accept that there is, I mean, for ordinary emotions, distinction between true and false opinion, unlike the standard account, then how can you distinguish then between, let's say, false opinion and, let's say, darkness of mind or evilness of mind? Because, I mean, once you have the false opinion about the matter, how you can still have some kind of clarity of mind, and once you have the true opinion, how you still can have some kind of darkness of mind, and what kind of mental state would be that, right? Like darkness of mind and evilness of mind. So that's, let's say, my doubt. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I think you're right to stress that these things look as if they're quite closely interrelated to one another. So, I mean, let me try and think of an example where someone might have a correct opinion but still be suffering from an emotion. I mean, well, I mean, the kind of a standard account we get in our evidence for Chrysippus and for Seneca is that once an emotion takes hold of you, it takes on a life of its own, and it's kind of out of control, and you have to wait for it to subside on its own. It's not as if you can just change your judgment and then your emotional life, you know, changes immediately. So, you know, so for instance, someone experiencing grief at the loss of a loved one might, you know, come to be persuaded that this isn't quite the tragedy that they initially thought it was. But it's not as if when they come to that realization, their grief will just turn off that moment. It will take time to dissipate. So maybe something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Would you like to add something, Edgar?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. And well, if I may, one last question. Well, I mean, it's a very general question, but do you have any views about this treatise from well, which is normally classified as one of the Aristotelian ethics, no, which is De Virtutibus et Vitis, no? And the reason I ask is that in the VV you find a lot of Stoic material, or at least a lot of material that coincides with Stoic ideas and Stoic concepts, no? For example, the divisions of the virtues and this distinction between primary and secondary virtues, things like that. It's a very short treatise, as you know, but still it does contain a lot of Stoic material, or at least a lot of material that seems to be Stoic. And I say that because there are people who think that the VV is genuine. I mean, it's an Aristotelian treatise. No, Simpson, for example, he has this work in the Classical Quarterly, and he argues that there is nothing that makes it impossible for the VV to be Aristotelian. But anyway, I think that it is a Stoic treatise, and so my question is, I mean, do you have any views about a possible parallel between the VV and Barlaam, because the topics that they deal with are very different, you know? And certainly the fourfold divisions in Barlaam between emotional disturbances is not in the VV, definitely. But what the parallel that could be drawn is that these are two texts in Latin, which are apparently late from I mean, they seem to be earlier than the Renaissance and much later than the Hellenistic period. They seem to be both later than Cicero and Seneca, of course, and so maybe there is a connection between them, or either philosophical or historical, or I mean, but I'm maybe you don't. Have you thought about that by any chance, John?
Yeah.
Sorry to ask you this, but maybe.
No, thank you. That's a really interesting suggestion. I have to say I haven't looked at it in relation to this, but I certainly will. I'll follow up the lead. Okay. And as you say, it kind of it fits in a number of different ways in terms of its kind of sort of this kind of sort of combination of Aristotelian Stoic themes, but also that kind of time period that we well worth looking at. Another text that didn't prove so fruitful, but struck me as something worth looking at, was the Pseudo Andronicus De Passionibus, which again is dealing with the same topic, is often thought to be an Aristotelian, or within the Aristotelian tradition in some way. And the version, what we've got looks to be very, very kind of truncated and summarized, but perhaps some earlier fuller version of that might have been a potential source as well. So yes, this kind of a number of different works that kind of, Aristotelian in some way, but drawing on some of this Stoic material, look like really interesting parallels.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Are there any more questions? No? Well, so John, thank you very much for participating in this seminar. Your talk was really very interesting, and I think we all enjoyed very much your talk, and I think that the discussion was interesting too. I hope you enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, no, thank you all very much for your comments and a couple of very interesting suggestions that I will follow up. So that's been very useful. Thank you, everyone.
So may I write you later to ask you for the reference of your edition of Barlaam?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Very well, and I can forward it to the people who signed in for the talk.
In fact, if I'm
or if you can,
if I'm organized, I can just drop it into the chat right now for everybody.
Yes, okay, go ahead. Oh, there it is.
So I'm currently compiling the indexes. So
yes, no, it's okay. Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you all for being here. And I hope to see you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye, everybody.